Run, river, run, run through the hills. Run, river, run to the sea. Run, river, run to your place beneath the sun. Run, river, run over me.
Hi, this is Jan Lewis. Welcome to be my guest. Today we have a very special guest from Holy Cross. He is a psychologist, teaches psychology at Holy Cross, and he has written a book about his mom. And it's called Do I Look at You with Love? That's a beautiful, beautiful picture. I was telling Mark, welcome Mark Freeman. Said, I got it. Look, she could be my mother's sister. Mark, this is pretty special. Reimagining the story of dementia. How did this all begin? What made you want to write the book?
There were a number of different sources. I mean, one of the things that I've done as a psychologist for 30 to 40 years is I study people's lives. I study life stories in the form of memoirs and autobiographies, sometimes in the form of interviews, and so on. And so I've had an interest in issues of memory and identity and personhood for a long time. And as I say, I've written about it extensively. And so when my mother was diagnosed, first and foremost, I responded as her son, with sympathy and care and so forth. But I also couldn't help but be fascinated by some of what I was seeing, because changes came about in her case, to her very sense of self, and I found myself certainly disturbed by what I saw.
Yeah.
But at the same time, partly because of my intellectual background and interests, also fascinated. And so I also began learning a lot about some of the things that I had written about, but maybe hadn't fully understood or had understood in too abstract a way. And so her experience proved in some ways to be a kind of living laboratory. And I was with her. She was in Worcester, living close by, within about 2 miles, for the entire dozen or so years of her dementia. And so she was diagnosed, I can't remember what year, it was 2005 or 2006.
How old was she at that time, Mark?
She was probably 81. And it came upon her fairly quickly, because I believe it was 1980. I was living, no, it wasn't not 1980. At that time, when she was about 80 years old, I had taken my family to live in Spain for the year. And my mother was able to fly to Madrid.
She came too?
By herself.
Whoa.
Well, she was only there for a visit, but she came by around the time of her birthday, and at that point was, for lack of a better way of putting it, a fully functioning person. Yeah. It wasn't too long after that when we began to see some pretty serious signs that something was
What were
amiss.
those? What were those signs you saw?
Some of them were things like sudden difficulty in being able to balance a checkbook, leaving things in places that she couldn't remember, and eventually that would turn into some pretty challenging stuff, because she would become convinced, as a lot of people with dementia or Alzheimer's do, that things were being stolen from her. You know, enough that we had to put locks on her closet, basically padlocks. And so on. So I was there with her from the start, and I got to witness what I describe in the book, which were phases. So, you know, the beginning of her experience was very, very different from the end. And I try to encapsulate that trajectory by talking about 4 distinct phases. The number 4 is somewhat arbitrary.
Yeah, I've got them right here.
But to me it made sense. And when my brothers and sisters-in-law and wife and immediate family read the book, they were able to agree that this is pretty much what it was like. They did learn some things, partly because they weren't there with the constancy that I was. But the basic storyline that I told is one that they've agreed is how it was.
We're talking with Mark Freeman, and he wrote a terrific book about his mom, Do I Look at You as Love? And it's about the journey she went through with dementia, and he was right along with her, very supportive. And you did a great job. I like the table of contents because it brings it right down. You mentioned those 4 or 5. The first one, a relational perspective in dementia.
Yeah.
Describe that.
That chapter, as you may recall, is probably the most academic chapter. What I do is I situate the task of studying somebody in one's own family, the challenges of doing that, some of the ethical challenges of doing that. In social science research, it's generally necessary to be able to get, quote, informed consent. And although my mother could have easily said, yes, I'd be delighted to speak with you, as she did, it's not clear that she really knew what that meant by the time we started doing this. It's not clear that she knew that I would eventually be writing a book about her and so on. I mean, I could tell her those things. And I did tell her those things just for the sake of kind of basic courtesy. But most of the things I told her evaporated from her memory within a minute. So there were some challenges there. But I also talk about ethical challenges on a different plane. And those challenges had to do with eventually giving myself over to her circumstances and her life. The beginning season, so to speak, was very, very difficult. It could be extremely frustrating. She could be extremely repetitive and would get very, very angry at things. She was explosive. And that was a tough period. And as I say, eventually I learned to be there with her, and within the boundaries of my own schedule and my own life, to be there for her, and not to impose my own sense of things on her or my own will on her, but learning to really accept her for what she was becoming, and to try to bring her as much human connection and meaning as I possibly could.
I think you said a really good key word, accepting.
Yeah.
It's tough. No one in my family went through that, except my mother, perhaps at the very end. She was in a nursing home, and she began to act a little differently.
Right.
Weird. I was her only daughter. We were quite close, and she'd look at me like, I'm thinking, what's going on with you? But, to accept it is tough, because that's not the mommy we had, right? It's awful.
Yeah. Yeah, and truthfully, there were people who really couldn't accept it. She had changed so radically that...
How'd your siblings handle it?
There was some variability.
Yeah.
One reason for that variability was that they might go, let's say, 4 months, 5 months without seeing her. And when that happened, it was often a shock to see her, because there would have been some significant decline. And so for them to walk in and see her after 4 months, 5 months, 6 months could be shocking and extremely disturbing, because they would be able to see her demise in the flesh. For me, it was all very gradual. And so there weren't those shocks to the system that they had.
Yeah.
And there's some variability also just in terms of how often people would check in on her. For instance, her own siblings Some of them wanted to know what was happening and came to visit her, and I think others either found it too painful
Yeah.
or asked, and I don't mean this in a callous way, is there really a reason to do this?
Oh, God, yeah.
There were people who asked the what's the point question,
Mhm.
and factually speaking, there's some rationale for that. Because if they traveled 1,000 miles to see her, she would forget that they were there within a minute.
Yeah.
So factually speaking, there was a reason to do that. Morally speaking, not so much.
Boy, I hear you. Loud and clear. We're talking with Mark Freeman, and he's written this wonderful book about his mother dedicated to her. Reimagining the story of dementia, Do I Look at You with Love? As I said before, I love the way you did the contents. You go through a relational perspective on dementia. Protest. What's that?
Yeah, so just to say something about the structure of the book. So there are the introductory pages, there is the chapter we just discussed, which is a kind of academic conceptual framing of some of the issues. The body of the book comprises 4 chapters.
Yep.
The first is called Protest, and we'll talk about that in a moment. The second is called Presence. The third, Dislocation, and the fourth, Release. Protest, put in the simplest of terms, is about that period when she herself protested the reality of her condition.
Did she realize it at first?
She realized it on some level.
Yeah.
I mean, to give you a sense of why it is that I'm qualifying that, the day I took her to the neurologist where she was diagnosed, and one of the few times the word Alzheimer's was used,
Oh, God, yeah.
she sobbed.
Oh.
Later that day, she had no memory of being to the neurologist.
Well, that was how pretty quick after you figured there was a problem.
It was.
Yeah.
I mean, we knew there was a problem before that, but we hadn't gotten an official diagnosis. So, I guess I would say she both knew and not knew.
Yeah.
I mean, she had to know something because she moved into an assisted living residence. But that was very puzzling for her and also very disturbing because when she moved into that place, she was a very attractive woman and she moved briskly and had social graces and all the rest. And there was a part of her, I think, that couldn't quite figure out what she was doing there. She felt terribly out of place.
Did she feel abandoned at all, do you think?
She felt abandoned at that phase, and that was a challenge for us because there was nothing that we could do to disabuse her of that. To just give you a for instance, we took her to a number of different assisted living places so that she could get a feel for them and have some idea of which she might prefer.
Sure.
But she had no memory of that. And so she was convinced that we had placed her there against her will.
Oh, my God.
And truthfully, it was extra difficult for me at times because I saw her repeatedly every week. And sometimes she would forget that too. And so she would feel utterly abandoned. And for me to protest and say something, as I sometimes did, Ma, I've been here 3 times this week. There was a part of her that couldn't believe that.
Yeah.
Because it wasn't part of her memory.
No.
And so, yeah, there were times when she felt abandoned. There were times when she felt that this was unfair and had been done against her will. And more than anything, the protest phase was when some of her competence and self-sufficiency and autonomy was in the process of becoming compromised. And she protested, often ragefully. I can do my paperwork. I can pay my bills. I still can drive a car, Mark. Do not tell me, etc., etc.
Right, exactly.
She would say things to me like, you're treating me like a child.
Oh, yeah.
I'm not an imbecile. And at that point, all I could really do is take it.
Yeah.
All I could do is take it. So protest was, in some ways, the most difficult phase, because it was then that she felt herself coming undone.
Lack of control.
Lack of control.
There is protest, presence, and dislocation.
So here's a strange transition that happened. As I said, she would often become disturbed, especially when her own self-sufficiency and autonomy were being cast into question or undermined.
Yeah.
But there were also times when that could be let go. And so we found ourselves taking her to concerts, taking her out for good meals, doing things that would basically steer her away from a focus on the ways in which she was coming undone. And I came to see a kind of correlation that I discuss in the book, and that is, the more her ego was on the line, the more she would suffer.
Yeah.
And the more she could let go or be immersed in circumstances that would, quote, let her go, the, quote, easier it would be. And so I had done a chapter for a book around that time that carried the subtitle Dementia's Tragic Promise. And the tragic promise was this: the, quote, worse she got, objectively speaking, the better she might be subjectively.
Yeah.
Right? That wouldn't happen for a while, but there was a phase when she could let go of her own ego and so on. And one of the things I describe in that book is a drive we took one day up to Mount Wachusett. Beautiful fall day, multiple colors, and she was transfixed.
Yeah.
She was transfixed. And she was transfixed in a way that you or I wouldn't be.
Yeah. She was like taking it all in.
She was taking it all in,
Yeah.
and because she also forgot what she had experienced moments before, it was constant.
Yeah.
And so it was like one great big wave of kind of ecstatic exaltation. Now, for me, it's a beautiful day.
Yeah.
I'm delighted to be there. I appreciate it. But I'm still making sure I'm steering the car and
Yeah.
making sure I get home to go to a meeting.
Yeah.
And so whatever delight I might have had or you might have had was still intermixed
Yeah.
with our basic concerns. But she was able for a brief while to experience a kind of pure immersion.
Awesome. She could have that of the child. The awesome.
It's in a way it was like a child, and the other metaphor that I flirted with is that she was like the Buddha,
the Buddha. Yeah.
living in the moment.
Living right then and there.
Living in the moment.
Mark.
And so at one point I say in that chapter, I don't know if you remember this, I said something like, read her for a moment.
Yeah.
I envied her.
Exactly. Well, they say, one day at a time, and you stay in the moment.
Right.
Mark, how can they get a hold of your book?
Well, there are a couple of different ways. You could certainly contact your local bookstore and ask them to get a copy. The publisher is Brill, and truthfully it sometimes takes some time for those copies to arrive. Probably the simplest and most direct way, if you want a copy of the book, is to go on to Amazon and just look it up. And there are some really quite lovely reviews there, and it'll give you a little bit more of a sense of what's in the book and what people are finding in it.
Mark, if somebody wanted you to come and give a presentation, book signing, would you go?
Sure.
Good.
Sure.
Now,
Yeah.
do you have a perimeter or time limit that you can do this with?
No, not really. I mean, it would make sense for me probably to stay within the New England area.
Okay, yeah. Oh, yeah.
But I've spoken about her at different times over the past 15 years in lots of different places, both here and abroad.
Yep.
But in terms of book signings or going to speak, let's say to a local senior center or what have you, I'm open to suggestion.
Oh, there's so many
Yeah.
venues for this kind of book.
Yeah.
A lot of baby boomers, maybe some Gen Xers who are taking care of their parents now and trying to run their own
Oh,
home.
absolutely. Yeah.
Now,
So if I can just say one thing as a kind of framing idea for the book, I flirt with the idea of calling it a tragic comedy. And I decided not to officially call it that. At one point that was in the subtitle, and I decided not to go for it. But one of the things that I do want to convey in this book is that in some instances of dementia, it's not exclusively tragic. There's a tragic dimension to it. The last thing I would want to do is sugarcoat it. And another last thing I would want to do is to say, it can be like this for your mother too. Because it's not the same for people. There are some people who have dementia who are pretty miserable.
yeah.
This story turned out to be a mix of the tragic and in some ways the beautiful. That drive up to Mount Wachusett with her was beautiful.
Yeah.
And I'll talk a little bit about the subsequent chapters, but even towards the end of her life, there were moments of intimacy and connection and beauty of a sort that that interestingly enough we probably would never have had
Yeah.
all this not happened.
Right. Is that a form of release that you would call it as one of those chapters?
I talk about that mainly in the chapter called Release.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I should probably address the one before that.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
First.
Dislocation.
Dislocation, you can probably get a sense of what that means from the word. The ecstatic immersion into the world that I just discussed in the context of the Presence chapter proved to be relatively short-lived.
Yeah.
As things, quote, progressed. She would often feel terribly dislocated. She wouldn't know where she was, and there were times when she wouldn't know who she was. And that scared the hell out of her.
Yeah. It scared her, she realized.
She did. There was a part of her that realized, and it was a challenge for me and my wife because we really were the remaining, in a way, lifelines to reality.
Sure.
And so it wasn't unusual for me to get a call from the front desk at the assisted living place where she lived and say, the woman would say, your mom needs to talk to you now. And she would get on the phone and she would say, Mark, I don't know where I am. I don't know who I am. And she would be extra puzzled. This is interesting in a way. I don't know how all my furniture got here. So she recognized her furniture because that was part of her long-term memory.
Right.
But she didn't recognize the apartment because she hadn't been there long enough, and it was more part of her short-term memory. And so some days that was okay. She would call me and say, well, I'm in a new place, and my furniture is here, but more often it would be, what is this? Where it was most acute is when she would wake up from a nap. You've probably had the experience maybe of being in a hotel room or wherever, and you wake up and it's unfamiliar, but within a matter of seconds you can say, oh right, I'm on vacation, I'm in a hotel room. Imagine what it might be like to wake up and to not be able to gather back where you are within those few seconds.
Panic time.
Panic.
I can feel it,
Panic.
sense it. It's like,
Yeah, and those are the kinds of words that I use to describe that third phase. And she also engaged in a lot of perseveration at that point. She had no idea how long she was at Tapnock Park. I mean, she could call me and say, I just arrived. I mean, she did that pretty regularly. And I still don't know whether this was the right thing to do, but there were times when I would say to her, Well, actually, you've been here for a while.
Yeah.
How long? I've been here for a while.
She didn't believe you. Yeah, I know
Yeah.
that.
How
Yeah.
long?
Yeah.
Well, it's 3 years now.
She wouldn't. No, she's not gonna go for that.
There was a part of her that would not believe it,
Mhm.
and a part of her that would. And of course, the part of her that would be horrified.
Mhm.
And so she would often say things like, "Oh my God,
Mm.
oh my,
Yeah.
like you're kidding me."
All right.
I eventually, these are moral challenges, and you can bet that people who are dealing with their loved ones in some way face these challenges. Some of them have to do with, well, how honest should I be about this?
Yeah.
What level of detail should I feel compelled to share? And the truth is, there were times when it seemed important for her to have some sense of the reality of things.
Mhm.
As the disease progressed, that became much less significant. She lived in a nursing home for 6 years. I don't know that she ever knew that she lived in a nursing home.
So that she went from assisted living to a nursing home.
Right.
Did she have any? Did they keep her busy? Did the crafts work at all? Working with her hands or reading?
She was kept fairly busy at the assisted living place,
Mhm.
although she often didn't like the activities and found them somewhat demeaning. And that's not a criticism of the place.
Yeah.
It's just like bingo all the time. I don't want to play bingo. So
Yeah.
there were some things that she would do
Yeah.
gladly, and there were other things she would not. By the time she got to the nursing home, she couldn't possibly read.
Yeah.
She really couldn't watch TV because her eyesight also had
Yeah.
deteriorated significantly. The thing that moved her the most in terms of activities always was music.
Ah, that's yeah.
Always was music.
Yeah. What was her favorite?
Oh, she loved stuff from her era. I mean, she especially loved stuff from, the 30s and 40s and 50s.
How about show tunes, musicals?
Loved show tunes, and by the way, had a great memory for all of that stuff, even when her memory for instance, my father
Yeah.
was gone. And so the memory for music. She also had a great memory for trivia.
Trivia.
So she became,
Yeah.
one of the quote favorite people on her floor.
Yeah.
Because even though there were parts of her memory that were decimated,
Yeah.
there were some other parts that were surprisingly
Intact.
high functioning and intact.
Mark, we've just got a couple of
Yeah.
minutes left.
Yeah, sure.
Once again, we're talking with Mark Freeman. He has written this great book, don't miss it. It's called Do I Look at You with Love? And it's reimagining the story of dementia, what he went through with his own mother. And I believe she was 93 when she passed.
That's right.
She had a lot. How many years was it total? 12 years before the
It's about 12 years.
Is that unusual with dementia?
No, it's really not.
Okay.
There are some forms of dementia that move more quick. First of all, there are many forms of dementia.
Yeah.
Some of them move much more quickly. Early onset dementia tends to move more quickly. But it's not a single disease or a single syndrome. And there were people on her floor that were there as long as she was, and some of them are probably still there. And there were others who left much more quickly.
Thank God you were there.
Yeah.
Really.
Yeah.
You don't see a whole lot of that nowadays. Usually it's...
Right.
I don't know. My dad, when my mother was sick, he was taking care of her, the caretaker. But what I learned watching my mother as a caretaker and my father, the caretaker must take care of themselves. Mentally, emotionally,
Sure.
physically. My father went...
Yeah.
His side, they live into their 90s. He never made it. He was 82.
Yeah.
He just collapsed taking care of her.
Yeah.
She lived for over a year in the nursing home.
Yeah.
But I watched this firsthand, and I learned early on. It's an incredible experience to watch someone you love just going, just...
Yeah. It is, but So with that but in mind, let me say a word about the next chapter, the chapter called Release.
Yeah.
So my mother eventually moved beyond the panic and terror phase that I just described. And that was a phase where she existed in a kind of steady state. She was not panicky. She was not disturbed. She was not upset. She had no idea where she was. She still had some idea who I was, although there were times when I could see that and other times when I couldn't. But we often would have to get reacquainted. I would see her. She would have a sense of who I was. And then the interviews would begin.
Yep.
And they would often take the form of, so who are you?
Yeah, who are you?
And what's your name? And I would often respond as a son. I'd say, I'm Mark.
Yeah.
And are you married? And so I wanted to just give you and potential readers a sense for where the title comes from.
Where, again, before we close, Mark, where can they get a hold of your book?
You can get a hold of the book certainly on Amazon. It's published by an international publisher called Brill. And if you have trouble locating Brill's website, you should feel free to email me, and I can give you direct information about how to contact Brill. But as I say, probably the easiest and most direct way is to go through Amazon. Although, with all due respect to Amazon, if you have a local bookseller that you respect and care for, maybe try to give them the business.
There you go. Thank you, Mark, for being with us.
Yeah.
Great book. I look at her picture and I'm like, that looks just exactly like my own mother. She's absolutely beautiful.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank
so
you.
Just a word about the title, though. And I know time is just about done. During one of these exchanges that we had in her final years, it was a series of questions. You know, who are you, and are you married, and so do you like me as a mother? Am I a good mother? Et cetera, et cetera. And one of the questions that she wound up asking, in a very casual way almost, was, so do I look at you with love?
There you go. There's the title.
There's the title.
And
that's
you
where it
remembered
came
that.
from. Oh, when I heard her say that, I actually thought to myself then and there, how amazing is that question?
Yeah. She sounded like a very empathetic type of person to have even said that. Do I look at you with love?
It's complicated in a way.
Yeah.
It's complicated. I mean, pretty far along in her dementia, she could say things to me like, oh, what this must be for you. Which is very sophisticated
Insight.
In a way.
Beautiful. Thank you, Mark, again.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Haven't read a book like this, I don't think, ever. This is a fantastic story, and he was great to stick by his mom, let me tell you. We'll see you next time on Be My Guest.
Riding on a shooting star, heading out toward a dream. Tomorrow's even closer than it seems.